Karoline Leavitt thought it was just another flight home. She never imagined that one small act of kindness would lead to a chilling mystery. When she gave up her first-class seat for an elderly veteran, she expected nothing in return. But within minutes, quiet whispers filled the cabin. Two men in suits locked eyes on him, and then he was gone. Passengers looked around in confusion, but before anyone could react, the plane jolted violently. Oxygen masks dropped. The captain's voice cracked through the speakers, his final words sending a wave of panic through the cabin. Something was terribly wrong. The veteran had disappeared, but he left something behind. A small unmarked bag under his seat. Was it a clue, a warning, or something far more dangerous? Federal agents rushed toward it, their faces tense with urgency. Who was this mysterious man? Why were authorities so desperate to track him down? And what secret did that bag hold? Karoline's simple act of kindness had unknowingly placed her at the center of a terrifying chain of events. The truth was unraveling fast, and by the time she realized what was happening, there was no turning back. This flight was never meant to land the way it was supposed to, and for those on board, survival was no longer guaranteed. The cabin buzzed with nervous energy. Passengers exchanged anxious glances, some clutching their armrests, others whispering in hushed tones. The flight attendants, normally calm and composed, moved with an urgency that only heightened the fear in the air. Karoline's heart pounded. She couldn't shake the image of the veteran's worn face, the way he had looked at her before taking her seat, almost as if he knew something no one else did. Had she just helped a man who was running from something? Or worse, someone? Then, without warning, the plane lurched again. A piercing alarm echoed through the cabin, and the overhead lights flickered. The captain's voice returned, but this time it was different. Shaky, urgent. Everyone, remain calm. We have a situation. A situation? Karoline gripped the armrest, her knuckles turning white. She looked back at the empty seat where the veteran had been sitting. The small, unmarked bag still rested beneath it, untouched. Before she could think, one of the suited men lunged forward. He grabbed the bag and shouted something into his earpiece. His partner stood, blocking the aisle, scanning the passengers with cold, calculating eyes. This flight is being diverted. Gasps filled the cabin. A woman clutched her child. A businessman frantically typed on his phone, trying to get a signal. Karoline's pulse raced. Diverted? Where? Why? Then she saw it. The look of sheer panic on the flight attendant's face as she whispered something to the co-pilot. This wasn't just a routine emergency. This was something far, far worse. And Karoline was right in the middle of it. The beat-IV hum of the engines was no longer the only sound filling the cabin. It was replaced by frantic whispers, rapid breathing, and the occasional stifled sob. Karoline's eyes darted between the suited men, and the bag clutched tightly in one of their hands. The man holding it wasn't just carrying it. He was gripping it like his life depended on it. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white. The other man, still blocking the aisle, adjusted something in his ear and gave a slight nod. Whatever was happening, it was planned. Karoline's mind raced. The veteran had vanished. The flight was being diverted. And now, whatever was inside that bag had the power to change everything. A sudden, sharp sound crackled through the speakers. Static, followed by the captain's voice. "This is your captain speaking. We are experiencing an unexpected situation. I need everyone to remain seated. We are making an emergency landing at an alternate location. Please comply with the flight crew's instructions." The announcement only fueled the growing panic. A man across the aisle shot up. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. "I have a right to know." Before he could say another word, one of the suited men reached into his jacket. Karoline's breath hitched. Was he reaching for a gun? A badge? But instead of either, he pulled out a small device, pressed a button, and suddenly, the in-flight. Entertainment screens went black. The Wi-Fi signal cut off. No one could contact the outside world now. The realization sent a wave of dread through Karoline. Whatever was happening wasn't just a simple diversion. This flight wasn't meant to land. It was meant to disappear. And unless she figured out the truth, she might disappear with it. The air inside the cabin grew heavy, thick with fear and confusion. Karoline's pulse pounded in her ears as she glanced around at the other passengers. Some were frozen in shock, others whispering frantically, their eyes darting toward the suited men who now held complete control over the plane. The man gripping the bag moved quickly, stepping toward the cockpit. The other remained in the aisle, his gaze sweeping over the passengers like a silent warning. "Stay put." Karoline swallowed hard, her mind racing. Who were these men? What was so important about that bag? And where was the veteran? A sharp gasp broke through the tense silence. One of the flight attendants, a young woman with wide, fearful eyes, had just returned from the front of the plane. She looked pale, shaken. She leaned toward another crew member and whispered something. The older attendant's face went slack with horror. Karoline caught the words. "The pilots. They're gone." Her stomach dropped. Gone? How? Where? The plane jolted again, sending a few passengers gripping their seats. Someone started praying. A child whimpered. The suited man, still in the aisle, spoke into his earpiece, his voice low and firm. "We're taking control now." Karoline's breath caught. This wasn't a diversion. This was a hijacking. The realization sent ice through her veins. The captain and co-pilot were missing. The two men in suits weren't just tracking the veteran, they were orchestrating something bigger. But the question that sent true terror through Karoline's body was simple. If the pilots were gone, who was flying the plane? Karoline's heart pounded as she reached the cockpit door, her hands trembling as she pushed it open. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. The captain and co-pilot were slumped over, unconscious or worse, while the control panel flashed with warning signals. The plane was still descending, and no one was at the controls. Behind her, the chaos in the cabin intensified. Passengers crying out. The struggle between the veteran and the suited men escalating. She had no choice. She had to act. Forcing herself forward, she gripped the controls, her mind racing. She wasn't a pilot, but she had to do something. The veteran's voice rang out behind her, firm and steady. "Listen to me. I'll guide you." Karoline swallowed her fear, her fingers hovering over the unfamiliar buttons and levers. She had started this journey with a simple act of kindness, but now she held the fate of an entire plane in her hands. There was no turning back. Karoline's breath came in short, uneven gasps as she stared at the overwhelming array of buttons, levers, and screens in front of her. The plane trembled, alarms blaring, altitude dropping dangerously fast. Behind her, the struggle continued. The veteran fighting off the remaining suited man, passengers screaming, chaos erupting. "Focus!" The veteran's voice cut through, the noise steady and commanding. "I need you to listen to me, Karoline. We don't have much time." "How do you know my name?" she gasped, gripping the yoke as the plane lurched again. "I know a lot of things," he replied, dodging a punch and pinning the suited man against a seat. "But right now, all you need to know is that I can get us out of this, if you trust me." Karoline swallowed hard. There was no other option. "What do I do?" "Steady the plane. Ease back on the controls. Just a little." Her hands shook, but she did as he said, pulling back gently. The nose of the plane began to lift, but it wasn't enough. The ground was still rushing toward them. "Flaps down now," he called. "Blue lever to your right." She reached over, fingers fumbling, and yanked the lever down. The plane shuddered, slowing slightly, but it still wasn't enough. The instruments flashed warnings, the ground growing closer by the second. Suddenly, a groggy voice crackled through the radio. "Control to Flight 2 on 17. Do you copy?" Karoline's eyes widened. "Help! Someone was out there!" "This is Flight 217, she shouted, barely able to keep the panic from her voice. "Our pilots are down. I don't know how to fly." Silence. Then, a calm, measured response. "We're going to talk you through this. Just stay with me." But before she could reply, a gunshot rang out behind her. She spun around. The veteran stood still, chest rising and falling heavily. At his feet, the last suited man lay motionless, the gun slipping from his hand. The cabin fell silent. The veteran locked eyes with her, then nodded toward the controls. "Keep going. We're not out of this yet." Karoline turned back, gripping the yoke tighter. They still had to land this plane. And failure wasn't an option. The radio crackled again. "Flight 217, you need to slow your descent. Pull back gently on the yoke. Nice and steady." Karoline's fingers tightened around the controls, her palms slick with sweat. Every move felt impossible. Every second stretched unbearably long. The ground was closing in too fast. "Come on, Karoline," the veteran urged, stepping beside her now. His voice was calm but firm, filled with a certainty that made her believe, maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. She inhaled sharply and pulled back. The plane groaned in protest, but the nose lifted slightly. The ground was still rushing toward them, but they weren't falling as fast. "Flaps full!" the air traffic controller ordered. "Got it," the veteran said, reaching over and pulling the lever down fully. The plane jolted, resisting their control, but its speed continued to drop. "Landing gear. Deploy now." Karoline's eyes darted over the unfamiliar controls. Her hands shook as she reached for the switch, flicking it downward. A low thud vibrated through the plane as the wheels locked into position. "Brace for impact!" The passengers screamed. Some gripped their seats, others held hands, whispering prayers. Karoline's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. Then, impact. The plane slammed into the ground, bouncing violently. Metal screeched. Overhead compartments burst open. Luggage flew forward. The wheels skidded, struggling against the force of landing at too high a speed. Karoline fought to keep the nose up, her arms straining as the force of the landing threatened to rip the yoke from her hands. The runway rushed past in a blur. Smoke filled the cabin. The emergency alarms screamed. Then, finally, the plane shuddered to a stop. Silence. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then, all at once, gasps and sobs of relief filled the air. "We made it," someone whispered. Karoline slumped forward, her body trembling. She had done it. They had done it. But before she could even process what had happened, the veteran turned to her. His face, once steady, was now filled with something she hadn't seen before. Urgency. "This isn't over," he said, voice low. "We have to move, now." Karoline's breath hitched. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Karoline barely had a second to process the words before the veteran grabbed her wrist and pulled her from the cockpit. The plane was eerily silent, except for the occasional whimper or the creak of shifting metal. Smoke curled through the cabin, the acrid scent stinging her nose. Passengers were still frozen in their seats, their minds catching up to the fact that they had just survived a near-fatal crash landing. Some sobbed in relief. Others sat wide-eyed, gripping their armrests like they still weren't sure if they had truly made it. But the veteran wasn't celebrating. He was moving with purpose, scanning the aisles, his eyes sharp and calculating. "We don't have much time," he muttered. "Time for what?" Karoline panted, struggling to keep up as he pushed forward. "Getting out of here before they get to us." The words sent a fresh wave of fear through her. "Who? The men in suits? They're gone." The veteran stopped so suddenly she almost crashed into him. He turned, gripping her shoulders. His eyes were dark, serious. "No, they're not." Karoline's stomach twisted. "But they were just the beginning." Before she could question him, a new sound cut through the chaos. Sirens. Flashing red and blue lights appeared outside the shattered windows. The rescue teams were arriving. Fire trucks, ambulances, police. But the veteran's grip on her arm only tightened. "They're coming for the plane," he whispered. "Not to save us." A shiver crawled down Karoline's spine. The other passengers had started moving now, some unbuckling their seatbelts, others helping each other up, but something felt off. The rescue teams weren't rushing in. They were waiting. Karoline's breath caught as she noticed something else. Beyond the flashing lights, a separate set of vehicles was arriving. Dark SUVs with tinted windows, moving with eerie precision. Men in black tactical gear stepped out, scanning the wreckage with unreadable expressions. "Government," the veteran murmured, his jaw tightening. "They'll clear out the passengers, but they're really here for one thing." Karoline swallowed hard. "The bag." The veteran nodded grimly. "And anyone connected to it." Her pulse pounded. "You mean me?" His silence was answer enough. A voice suddenly blared over the loudspeakers outside. "Stay in your seats. Do not attempt to leave the aircraft. We are securing the situation. Securing, not rescuing." The veteran grabbed her hand. "If we stay here, we're as good as dead. We need to go. Now." Karoline's eyes darted to the emergency exit. They had landed near a stretch of trees, away from the main airport. If they could make it into the woods before the agents boarded, they might have a chance. But then, a new sound. A low, mechanical whir. She turned just in time to see something hovering outside the wreckage. A sleek, black drone, its red light blinking, scanning the plane. It stopped, directly in front of her window, and locked onto her face. The veteran cursed. "They've already marked us." Karoline's breath hitched. There was no time left. They had to run. Karoline's pulse thundered in her ears as the drone's red light pulsed, locking onto her face like a predator marking its prey. The veteran didn't hesitate. He yanked her toward the emergency exit, shoving aside a dazed passenger who barely registered what was happening. "Move!" he barked, his voice cutting through the confusion. Karoline fumbled with the lever, her fingers slick with sweat. The door groaned, resisting for a moment before it finally burst open, revealing the chaos outside. Smoke curled into the night air, mixing with the harsh glow of the rescue lights. The distant hum of more approaching. Vehicles sent a fresh wave of terror through her. "We have to jump," the veteran said. Karoline's stomach twisted. Jump? The plane had landed on a stretch of overgrown terrain, the ground uneven and littered with debris. It wasn't a fatal drop, but it wasn't exactly safe either. Behind them, shouts erupted inside the cabin. The authorities were boarding. "Go!" The veteran shoved her forward. Karoline squeezed her eyes shut and leaped. Her body slammed against the ground, the impact jarring her bones. But she was alive. A second later, the veteran landed beside her, rolling to absorb the shock before pulling her up. "Run!" They took off toward the trees, the cover of darkness their only chance. Every muscle in Karoline's body screamed, but adrenaline kept her moving. Branches whipped against her arms as they tore through the brush. Behind them, the beater shouts grew louder. Flashlights cut through the night. Then, gunfire. Bullets tore through the trees, splintering bark, thudding into the ground around them. Karoline choked back a scream, her legs burning as she pushed herself faster. The veteran was just ahead, his movements swift, purposeful. He had done this before. They burst into a clearing, and suddenly he skidded to a stop. Karoline nearly crashed into him. "What?" she started, but then she saw it. A helicopter, sleek, unmarked, waiting. A figure stood by the open door, silhouetted against the floodlights. "You're late," the figure called out. Karoline's head spun. "You know them?" she gasped. The veteran didn't answer. Instead, he turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You have two choices, Karoline. Get on that helicopter and live, or stay here and find out what happens when the government catches you." Her heart pounded. Sirens blared in the distance. The red light of the drone still burned in her mind. She had never asked for this, never meant for any of it to happen. But there was no going back. She took a deep breath and stepped toward the helicopter. The wind from the helicopter blades whipped around Karoline as she climbed inside, her heart still hammering against her ribs. The veteran followed close behind, pulling the door shut just as more gunfire cracked through the trees. The pilot, a woman with sharp eyes and an expression of pure focus, didn't wait for instructions. The moment the door was sealed, she pulled the stick, and the helicopter lurched upward. Karoline's breath came in ragged gasps as she peered out the window. Below, the wreckage of Flight 217 shrank into the distance, now swarming with agents. Flashlights scanned the woods, figures in tactical gear moving in formation, searching for them. She turned to the veteran, her voice hoarse. "Who are you?" He met her gaze, studying her for a long moment before finally speaking. "Someone who just saved your life." "That's not an answer," she snapped, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "What was in that bag? Why were they after you?" The pilot cut in. "We don't have time for questions. Not yet." Karoline exhaled sharply, running a hand through her tangled hair. Nothing made sense. She had started this day thinking she was just a passenger on a routine flight. Now, she was in a helicopter with a man whose past was a mystery, running from a government that clearly wasn't interested in rescuing them. The veteran sighed and leaned back against the seat. "You were never supposed to be part of this," he admitted. "But when you gave up your seat for me, you changed everything." Karoline swallowed hard. A simple act of kindness had set off a chain of events she never could have imagined. And now, she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to return to her normal life. The helicopter banked west, disappearing into the night. Whatever she had stumbled into, it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As the helicopter soared into the night, Karoline took one last look at the chaos below. The wreckage of Flight 217, the flashing lights, the agents swarming the area. It all felt like a distant nightmare, yet she knew it was real. Too real. She turned away from the window, exhaling slowly. What happens now? The veteran glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Now? You disappear. A chill ran down her spine. Disappear. The weight of the word settled deep in her chest. She had a life before this. A home, a job, people who cared about her. But after tonight, after what she had seen, that life was over. She had stepped onto a plane as Karoline Leavitt, an ordinary passenger. Now, she was something else. Someone else. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset. We're approaching the safe zone. The veteran looked at her one last time. You ready? Karoline didn't know if she'd ever be ready, but as she stared out into the dark horizon, one thing was clear. There was no turning back. The helicopter disappeared into the night, taking her toward a new destiny. And just like that, Karoline Leavitt was gone. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the bell icon to stay updated with our latest content. Your support motivates us to create even better videos, so come and be a part of this journey with us.